All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Iowa Learning Farms webinar. My name is Elena Whitaker, and I'm a water and conservation educator with Iowa Learning Farms. And today we are joined with Dr. Amanda Gumbert from the University of Kentucky. She's an extension specialist for water quality, and she'll be talking about engaging farms and conservation leadership. If you have any questions for Dr. Gumbert, please go ahead and submit them to the chat, and we'll get them answered at the end of her talk. With that, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me today. It's exciting to be talking to folks here at the Iowa Learning Farms and all of you who are in attendance. I'm sure you're scattered about, but thanks for joining us. I'm Amanda Gumbert, and I'm an extension specialist for water quality at the University of Kentucky. Before I get too deep into the presentation and the content, I do want to acknowledge that I have a lot of partners that I work with, including Matt Helmers at Iowa State. So many of you know Matt. But we work together through a group called Sarah 46, which is a land grant consortium of universities in the Mississippi River Basin. Also, for the content of this presentation, I've worked a lot with Beth Baker at Mississippi State University, and then Jenny Seifert, Brittany Isidore, and Amber Mays at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So just want to make sure I acknowledge those collaborators. We all work together equally on these projects. And also to acknowledge the funding for some of the work we do has come from US EPA programs, specifically the Gulf of Mexico's division, their Farmer to Farmer program, and then also Section 319 of the Clean Water Act. So I work on that a lot in Kentucky, and I know the 319 program has been really involved in a lot of watershed work throughout the Midwest. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about engaging farmers in conservation leadership. I will start before we get into the details of that. I will start with a little just level setting and making sure we know kind of the context that we're talking about. This graphic on the left that of your screen is a map of the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin. And every time I see this graphic, I'm just really blown away at the size of this one watershed, this large river basin that connects all of us. And the size of it and the quantity of acreage that drains to one common location, and that being the Gulf of Mexico. So 41% of the contiguous US drains to the Gulf of Mexico. And the graphic on the right shows you just an illustration of the concern that we have really about the quality of water in the Gulf. And so many of you are familiar with this too, but we do have runoff from farms and cities. So the farms are highlighted in the green areas and the cities in the red. And runoff from both of those land uses can carry nutrient-rich water to the Gulf of Mexico and cause a large hypoxic or dead zone every summer that forms there. And so that has been kind of the backbone concern of a lot of the work that we've been doing recently related to nutrient management and engaging farmers in this effort to reduce non-point source pollution. So quickly, I'll go through a few graphics of what this really looks like in the Gulf. So in the summer, this dead zone forms in the summer, and typically in late July, scientists go out and they're measuring dissolved oxygen in the water column. And so this is 2021's dead zone. And you can see that it's about 6,300 square miles or about 4 million acres. And I always try to do that acreage equivalent because it just conceptually helps me to understand what that size looks like. And, you know, I always equate an acre to approximately the size of a football field. So if you can imagine 4 million football fields out in the Gulf of Mexico, that's the size of that hypoxic or dead zone in 2021. And I'll quickly skip through. This is 2022, so you see a much smaller dead zone, so down to about 3,200 square miles. And then 2023 was even smaller at 3,000 square miles. And so we kind of can look at this and go, hey, maybe our stuff's working. Maybe this conservation that we're doing on the ground is helpful. And it is. But also, we have to remember there are lots of factors that influence the size of the dead zone. And included in that are those summer river flow rates. So 2022 and 23 had drought in parts of the larger watershed in the basin. And so we had lower flow rates, so less water moving off of the landscape, less water carrying nutrients with it. So the good news is some of that water or some of the nutrients stayed on the landscape. Bad news is we had low flow rates and low water levels on the Mississippi River. So when we think about reducing these nutrient losses, this is kind of a big picture effort with a lot of federal agencies. I've mentioned Sarah 46. Those are our land grant institutions that are working together on nutrient reduction losses. And also the states individually. So the states within the Mississippi River Basin, or the main stem states, have all developed state-based nutrient reduction strategies. And so with the overall goal of looking at a 45% reduction in nutrients lost from the landscape. So you've all maybe heard this a lot or heard about it or know quite a bit about it. Iowa has been certainly a leader in this area of conservation. So we kind of can think about two different types of ways that nutrients are lost or from the landscape and get into the main water bodies. First of all, are point sources, and then we're talking about municipal wastewater treatment plants, industry, or any other you know, entity that has a permitted discharge. That means that they are allowed to permit a certain amount of nutrient into the water body based on how they're either producing it from an industrial usage or process. Non-point source pollution and non-point sources of nutrients, typically we're talking about ag there as well as urban and suburban landscapes. So non-point source is a little trickier, right? It's a little harder to figure out where it's coming from, harder to measure, and harder to figure out, how we adjust and deal with these sources of pollution. So I mentioned Iowa State has been a leader and Iowa as a whole in the nutrient reduction strategy development. And, I was recently looking at the interactive dashboard of tracking the progress of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. It's really impressive. So there's a lot of good work that's gone into this and a lot of effort from a lot of people. And it's really great to look at the approach that different agencies and organizations and universities have put into reaching the goal of reducing nutrient losses from the landscape. Here in Kentucky, we also have a nutrient reduction strategy. We updated that about a year and a half ago. We have a non-point source focus as well as a point source focus. We're looking at local issues like how do we reduce harmful algal blooms? How do we reduce drinking water issues? So if our source water for a particular area, drinking water, has an algal bloom, that's going to affect taste and odor and those concerns as well as the health of it. Can we even drink the water? And then from an ag perspective, we're really looking at how do we reduce erosion and how do we reduce the loss of soil. And so a lot of it boils down to, from an ag perspective and working with farmers, we're looking at nitrogen management practices and phosphorus management practices. So, in terms of nitrogen, that's looking at, different fertilizer application rates. Maybe it's manure that's being used. How are we applying that? How are we storing manure for later usage? Those kind of things. Where might we be losing nitrogen from the landscape? With phosphorus, especially here in Kentucky, we look at phosphorus tied to soil because our sediments typically have phosphorus. We have really high phosphatic soils here in Kentucky. And so when we're losing soil, we're losing phosphorus. So we're looking at those erosion control measures quite a bit as well. So We know that farmers are doing a lot related to conservation and water quality. We have many examples of farmer leadership in the basin. Wisconsin has farmer-led watershed councils, and I'm really fascinated with those. If you don't know much about those, I encourage you to look into it. They're in a way they function a little the way our conservation districts function here in Kentucky, but they are watershed-based farmer groups who organize. They can apply for money to help implement conservation in their watershed, which is decided upon by farmers. So farmers are really leading that effort. We've got Practical Farmers of Iowa, where farmers are really functioning in leadership roles to share information. The Illinois STAR program was born from a conservation district in Illinois and really a response to Illinois nutrient reduction strategy efforts. And then one thing I want to tell you about too is a curriculum called Tap Your Potential. That's a farmer leadership curriculum that's been developed by land grant institutions and the Sarah 46, the group I've worked with. And it's just it's a really neat program. You could use it with a group of farmers in a watershed. I've used it here in Kentucky. It's been field tested in Ohio and in Arkansas as well. And you folks get together and go through some training related to watershed science, but also related to leadership. And it's all directed toward farmers to hopefully increase their confidence, not only in implementing conservation on their own farm, but also being willing to share that information with other farmers. So those are, some examples of farmer leadership that's going on. And we'll talk about some other projects that we've been doing as well. So when we think about behavior change, and I will be the first to say, I want it to be clear, I am not a social scientist at all by training. I'm a soil scientist by training, and I've worked in extension for a long time. So basically, I just like to talk to people about conservation. So that's my background in social science. But my collaborators are trained in social sciences, and we just know that peer-to-peer communication is really considered a gold standard for behavior change. And so in extension, we do this really well, right? We bring farmers together, we have field days. It's kind of a traditional extension approach to how we share information. We may have meetups, those kind of things, and we allow farmers to talk to farmers. Every now and then, a farmer wants to hear from a content expert, but I think by and large, farmers will say, we just want to talk to others and see how they've used a practice, what's worked, what hasn't, what have been problems, how did they troubleshoot, those kind of conversations. Also, I will say that the work that we're looking at, we're really targeting middle adopters. And what I mean by that are, you probably familiar with terms like this with early adopters. Those are the folks that as soon as the technology comes out, and technology is a loose term there, but as soon as a new practice, approach, what have you, is available or we know about it, they're trying it. Or maybe they're developing new ways on their own farm. They're experimenting all the time. Those are the early adopters. Middle adopters are the group that might need a little more encouragement or a little more information, or they're really they need extra help in troubleshooting. And so, we're looking at this in terms of what can we provide that can help increase that adoption of conservation practices on the farm and break down whatever adoption barrier is there. So I'm going to tell you about several specific events and activities that we have done over the past 3 or 4 years. And one thing that we did was we had strategized to have these farmer exchanges throughout the Mississippi River Basin. Now, remember, I showed you that map, and it's a big area, right? And so sometimes you're going, wait a minute, farmers aren't going to go that far. They hardly will go to the next county for a field day, much less travel, out of state or across the basin. So we tried to organize a group of farmers who wanted to talk to each other and learn from each other and are willing to try some new things or at least be up for a bit of travel. So we snuck this in February of 2020. So right before our COVID shutdown started to happen. But we had a 2-day farmer exchange. And we met up in Memphis, Tennessee, and then we traveled down to a farm in the Mississippi Delta, and then we crossed the river into the Arkansas Delta and met with another farmer. And the topics we were looking into: cover crops, tillage, and then also thinking about soil moisture sensors for triggering, when we needed to irrigate, and how can you time your irrigation schedule, not only to save water but also to manage nutrients as well. And the nice thing about this is that our farmers saw some of the practices and equipment in person in action. It rained on us, so we got to see the cover crops functioning really well. It was maybe not the best environment for being out in the field, but it was perfect, right? And our farmers are out regardless of the weather. So if we're there to learn, it doesn't really matter what the rain or what the weather does for us. And we had so we were looking at what was going on, but also had time to have these informal conversations. And we, consider those the shop talks of just the best thing that happened. You see it in the picture here is when the organizers just stepped away and let the farmers talk to each other. And so sometimes that's what we have to learn to do is we just create the space and the opportunity and then, allow folks to have conversation that's meaningful. So we had 27 participants that represented 4 states. Overall, we had about 39,000 acres that were impacted by those who attended. We did a follow-up survey of the participants, and 67% planned to adopt a conservation practice they had learned about. 100% of the attendees learned practices to save money on the farms that they manage or advise, and 100% gained confidence to implement a conservation practice. So overall, we felt like that was a success. And so here's a picture of us just sitting around in one of the farm shops, talking about some challenges that were happening on the farms. And our farmers really led that conversation. And we as participants, tried to observe and listen and figure out if there were things that we could do to help serve our farmers better. Because these are the farmers who showed up. Some of them have come to serve on an advisory committee for some of our projects. So we really take to heart their points of view and their comments. And one thing that did come from these conversations was we asked farmers, how valuable is it for you to go to a field day? Or how can you justify being off the farm to go to a field day? And so one farmer's response was, well, if I leave that field day or event with one good idea that I can implement on the farm, then it's worth my time. And so we capitalized on that because we thought this is great, absolutely. And so Jenny Seifert, my colleague at University of Wisconsin-Madison, took that and ran with it. So she's the marketing communications person of our team. And so she kind of had this idea and built this virtual platform that is a clearinghouse of videos, podcasts, etc., of practical advice and practical ideas and conversations from farmers and created by farmers for farmers. And so if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do so. Maybe later I can drop that link in the chat for you, but we're still building the platform, but this idea was born from those shop talk conversations. So to follow that, we intended the next year to do another location and get farmers together. And of course, in February of 2021, nobody was going anywhere. So we had a virtual platform for farmer exchanges that we just called Virtual Farmer Shop Talks. We had 4 shop talks, so a series of 4, and we did see higher attendance because it was easier for folks to attend if they were attending, sitting in their office or at their kitchen table versus traveling somewhere. And like I said, nobody was traveling. So we had 114 unique participants from all of our 12 basin states, those main stem Mississippi River Basin states, plus attendees from 6 states outside of the basin. Over 66,000 acres of land were managed by those attending the shop talks. So we were really pleased with the turnout. These are some of the topics. So this is some of our advertising pieces that we used. So we were looking at financial incentives for conservation or what made financial sense for implementing conservation. We had managing, a second topic was managing nutrients on the farm, and then on farm trials. And then our fourth event was strictly a farmer panel. So only farmers talking to each other and just having conversation. Those are recorded. I can share where you can look at those if you'd like later on. The format that we used was facilitated panel presentations. So we would invite 1 to 2 farmers for each event. They would present some of their experiences related to the topic, and then 1 content expert who might be a university researcher or extension person or somebody working within industry on that topic. And so we would have everybody together in the virtual space, kind of like we are right now. Somebody presents, then then we would use breakout rooms to have conversation, and then come back together to wrap up. So these are some of our farmers. These are 2 Wisconsin farmers that presented on nitrogen use efficiency and some of the trials that they've used, on their farms. So, and I don't intend for you to take all the data away from this, but just wanted to show you that we felt like really good participation. And we started in February. These ran every 2 weeks through February and March. And then as the time went on, our participation dwindled a bit. And I suspect some of that had to do with people getting bombarded with things to do, being able to attend 1 or 2, but not all. And also across the basin, we're looking at a really high variety and high variability of spring planting dates, and they may have been in the field terminating covers or getting ready for planting season. So that's just kind of we did a breakdown too, looking at farmers and farm advisors, as well as other participants. And so you see that list of other participants we're talking about. Our farm advisors, of course, would be folks like yourselves, conservation district employees, government employees, non-operating landowners. So they might not identify as a farmer, but they are indeed a landowner, researchers, grad students, extension educators, et cetera. And so we did see it was common that folks wore more than 1 hat. And we see this over and over again, right? So some folks are part-time farmers, but also have a full-time job off the farm. So the virtual platform probably was much more conducive for them to join. So here's a bit of feedback from our farmers, and quotes from all these are quotes from our farmers, and this is really related to conservation practices impacting their economics. One farmer said it has improved my yields, meaning using conservation. I feel like it's improved my yields on soybeans. I'm a big proponent of putting your nutrients in the right place at the right time. And then another farmer said, I just can't believe how much better my no-till corn is than what my conventionally tilled corn was before I started into this. So that's been a huge impact to my bottom line. So really just looking at production differences there. When we asked farmers about support systems, so the other thing we tried to do is not just encourage middle adopters to adopt practices, but also we wanted to create this network of farmers who were like-minded, and so that they could ask each other questions without any fear of judgment or feeling like the odd person out. And so one of our farmers says, it's been kind of tough for me. There aren't really very many people with cover crops around here. There just aren't. So I don't have that many people to rely on. And then went on to say, so it's groups like this that I appreciate the most because it gives me an opportunity to sort of get out of my area. The thing I value the most is the person-to-person interactions. So again, just going back to that peer-to-peer learning that we know from the literature, but we're also seeing from our own personal experiences with these types of programs. So quickly run down our survey of our participants. So we had those 4 events. We surveyed them after the end of the 4, and we did have kind of a low response rate. But of those who responded, 89% learned about practices that would save money on their farms. 78% learned about a resource to help them implement conservation practices. 89% gained confidence in their ability to effectively implement conservation practices, and 100%, no, this is no shocker here, appreciated hearing directly from other farmers. And so our respondents really favored group discussions with one another over listening to panelists or listening to experts. And so that's a real, learning point for us all who feel like we have to deliver information, but really sometimes it's best for us to just listen. We had one final in-person activity in Wisconsin in June of 2022. And so similar format to the Tennessee, Memphis, Arkansas. We traveled by bus to 2 farms. We had various topics that we looked into related to crop production, and just, heard some really honest conversation from farmers to other farmers about benefits, challenges, motivations. And the second day was a half-day classroom um, with some experts as well as farmers that were, and I'd hesitate to say experts, but researchers, content type folks who are specifically working on certain areas. We had 60 participants from 5 states plus Virginia, so 5 basin states plus Virginia. A third of our attendees were farmers, but also heavily attended by other university folks, government agencies, and conservation professionals. Um, Again, we saw a pretty significant response of feeling more connected to a community of conservation-minded farmers. 95% say it was important to hear directly from farmers about implementing practices, and 84% feel more confident talking to others after that. So that was important to note. I'm looking at my time, and I've just got a few more slides, and then we'll have some time for questions. So here's a picture of us hearing from one of the local farmers. Some of, at this particular farm, these folks were involved in their local watershed, farmer-led watershed council. So that was exciting to hear, and exciting to hear their stewardship approach and their stewardship focus on the farm. I added a little screenshot there of the weather that day. So this is mid-June in Wisconsin, and it felt like 104 degrees. So we had wet, rainy weather. We have a heat advisory. But just knowing that, like, this is part of field days, right? If you plan and host field days, you know that you don't know what you're going to get. And this is reflective too of what farmers are dealing with every day. So it doesn't hurt us to organize events around that too. So just a bit of a format comparison. Weather is a factor in person, not a factor virtually. In person, it's not easy to record presentations or share ideas. I think over the last several years, we're now really accustomed to being able to record presentations and hoping we can get back to them later. Those are much easier in virtual spaces like this one, but not as easy when we're out in the field. There was a lot of opportunity for side conversations when we're in person, as you're walking from one spot to another, or if you're sitting around having lunch. It's easy to talk to somebody and have those side conversations, where sometimes we miss out on that in these virtual spaces. And the visuals are very effective. When you can see a practice in place, you can see cover crops working, and you see runoff that is going by, but it's clear. And so the conservation practice is working. And in a virtual space, sometimes folks are less likely to speak up, and we know that. So this is my last couple slides. So it's like, okay, what now? Well, we're going to continue to try to create more learning opportunities and encourage organic idea sharing via the One Good Idea site. We crowdsource our information, so we're always looking for and open to getting more content. So check that out. There's direction on the site for getting more content. And as luck may have it, we have we're currently in another series of what we're calling Good Idea Shop Talks. We had our first one last week. Our second one is tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Central Time or 12:30 Eastern. You can register at the One Good Idea website. Just scroll down about a third of the way down, and you'll see a link to the shop talks. And we are just creating meetup series for row crop and livestock producers to exchange ideas. So if you're a farm advisor, we just encourage you to bring along a farmer because we want to make sure this is primarily focused on farmers. It's for farmers. We want them to have a space to chat. And here's a screenshot from us last week, and we're all laughing because if you notice in the bottom right corner, there is a barrel of fish. And one of our producers who was on was literally picking up a load of invasive carp that he was going to then ferment and turn into fertilizer. So like these are the real life scenarios that farmers do. We know there's some folks doing some innovative and different things out there, and having these live conversations sometimes makes that really helpful. So again, here's my contact information. If you have questions, I'm happy to have conversation with you, and a link to our One Good Idea platform. So Elena, I think you are up next with the final slides.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So, if you watched this today and would like to receive a CCA credit, go ahead and email me. My email is AlenaW, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 p.m. today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch this webinar if it was different, and then your CCA number, and I will get those submitted for credits. If you could hit the next slide, please. So if you are tuning in to watch this live, please fill out our voluntary demographic survey. Only one response is needed for 2024. So if you already done it for our couple previous webinars, you're good to go. Otherwise, this is your first time joining us. Please fill out this survey. It's iowalearningfarms.org/survey, or you can use the QR code there on the screen. And then lastly, before we get to questions, which we already have some questions, I just want to kind of advertise our webinar for next week. So Amanda, if you could switch to the very last slide there, please. Perfect. So we are having Dr. Catherine Densman here at Iowa State talking about community approaches to pesticide resistance management. So join us next week for that. She'll be on, or we'll all be on at noon for that. So, okay, we've gotten a bunch of questions so far. If you have some, please keep submitting them. First question. In addition to information and peer interactions, aren't financial incentives often effective at getting middle and late adopters on board? This person is saying that their experiences is that many farmers can't afford the costs or don't want to put their own money into converting productive land.
Yes, and absolutely, I agree with that. And some of our projects also are coupled with additional mini grant opportunities that have financial incentives there. So all states, in the basin are different. Of course, our farmers have access or the opportunity to apply for federal cost share programs through Farm Bill programs through, EQIP, CSP, et cetera. Those programs, many of our states have state-based cost share programs. There are NGOs sometimes that will offer those incentives. But yes, I would agree that having those extra financial incentives coupled with the education, coupled with the conversations and building that community of conservation, yes, I totally agree that those certainly help with that last push toward adoption for sure. But, some of the conversation that we're hearing too from our farmer leaders is they're saying, and I think some of this is some of the most interesting part. And again, that financial piece is very important because if you don't have the extra dollars to put into the conservation practice itself, if there is, that part, it's hard to even get started. But we had a farmer who told us that he was enrolled in some cover crop incentive programs, and it had a very strict, really prescription of how much seed he had to put out and at what rate, et cetera. And after doing that a couple of years, he said, you know what? I'm doing better just doing my own rate. I'm not even going to ask for the cost share dollars. I'm seeing a financial benefit, or another production benefit that I'm just going to pull out of that program. I'm going to write out my contract, and then I'm going to say, you know what, I'll just do this on my own. I know what seeding rate I want to use. And then he was saving money on cover crop seed, but still getting a conservation benefit. So yeah.
Nice. Our first question, or our next question, what are the first steps that you can recommend when reaching out to farmers about conservation practices, um, all while being sensitive on telling them like how to tend their land? And then once that connection has been established, what do you recommend them doing first to adopt even more conservation practices?
Whew, that's a big question. It's a lot. So I think the first part of that is, how do you really kind of have those initial conversations? And I think you're right in that being sensitive to that initial interaction is crucial. Um, Sometimes I like to just start talking to farmers that ask them if they wouldn't mind to share some challenges that they have on the farm. So it's not really about the conservation, or hey, why don't you do conservation on your farm? Because a lot of farmers are doing a lot of conservation practices, whether or not they know it or whether or not they're involved in a program. Um, but having an open and honest conversation of curiosity. So it's like really coming to them to listen, not to tell them what they ought to do, but really to listen. Because if you can establish some common ground and have a relationship, and if you're in extension, like, this is all about building relationships, um and and having this trust. You have to build the trust of, I want to listen to you. Where are you having problems on the farm, and where can we help with that? Right. And also, like, what season is it? Right now we're in late January in Kentucky. Last week we had the Arctic blast. And I know I'm not going to complain about snow for Iowa. Like, I see the snow outside your window. Atlanta. But we had a lot of snow. It was like, hovering around zero temps. And then now it is rainy and 45 or 50 degrees. And so we're in mud season. And if I'm talking to a livestock producer, I might say, where are your muddy spots on the farm? And sometimes they might squirm a little, and they're like, well, it's around the gate, and um, that it's this or that. And so you just kind of ease into these conversations, and then maybe say, I've heard other farmers say this has worked. What would you think about trying that? Or, is there something that's preventing you from trying it? And just like having that authentic concern and wanting to help is a good place to be.
Perfect. Okay. Next question. How did you go about recruiting or inviting participants for the farmer exchanges?
So we've used our extension networks primarily. Like I mentioned, that Sarah 46 group, and that really is all of my extension colleagues that are similar to me in the Mississippi River Basin. We used our local networks, trying to share the message with our extension agents, our conservation district personnel who have those direct contacts with farmers. They're doing those daily interactions. Um, we use commodity groups to try to advertise it. We use social media. We know we're not hitting everybody. Like, it's just, you do the best you can, and you find folks who are willing partners who will help share that information. So, yeah, it's just any way and every way that we possibly can advertise. But that's pretty much how we start.
Nice. And kind of then along with that, um, what kind of outreach did you do to get attendees, um, or like the speakers at these events?
Some of it was kind of a similar, who do who's on our project team, and who do we know um, who've been speakers at other farmer events, or are well known within the ag community, or well respected. Um, with the conservation finance topic that we did, that was Compeer Financial was the group who spoke, and was kind of the content expert on that. So they've done conservation finance. That was a little bit new to me, but we have a lot of conversations among some of the farmers I work with, as well as agency folks, where we're like, okay, so how do we help a farmer, if your cost share program is you have to put in 20 or 25% of the cost of the practice, what if you can't come up with that? Like, how can we initiate a loan on that somehow? And, or banks kind of are squeamish sometimes, and you never know what they're going to loan on or not loan on, and then what's the risk? And so really that conversation was about how do we look at diverse ways to finance conservation. And so that was somebody who on our project team who had heard them speak about that. So it was kind of, that's the beauty of having a network that is, multiple states wide, is that somebody knows somebody on some content or have worked with them. And in extension, we just don't take no for an answer. We just keep digging till we find somebody.
This next question is, how do you advertise your field days or virtual meetings, like for traditional communication methods? Have you found email, newspaper, mail, or anything like that? Do any of those work better than others?
That's hard to say. It's hard. We didn't do, really, and this is the scientist in me to answer that. Like we didn't track, how you found out about us, and how you came. I like personally, I kind of think about what works for me. And I get bombarded. I look at, with, virtual advertisements and stuff. And so like sometimes I ignore those. But then if I get a postcard in the mail, sometimes just because it's a different way to look at information, I might read that and respond. Um, I don't know who reads newspapers anymore or where print newspapers are available. But if you have a newspaper article, some of our county agents here in Kentucky still do a weekly article that they will distribute locally. And so we would ask them to advertise. Some of it too is just personal contact. Like, what farmers do I know who would benefit from this? And then asking them to bring a farmer friend with them. And sometimes that's what we've done. And sometimes we like repeat, we just go back to the same people over and over and over. And so we have to also be aware of that and not, not ask them too much. But we also use like I mentioned this, a farmer advisory panel. And we do incentivize them for participating. So they'll get a small, modest yearly stipend to help us plan some of this. And they have really good ideas too of how to share the information and find audiences. So we use that. So a little bit of everything.
Nice. Uh, this person is saying you mentioned that Practical Farmers of Iowa and the STAR program as different cost share programs, but they're wondering if you've looked into the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund at all or anything like that for cost
No,
share.
um, I haven't, and we haven't with our programs. Um, I don't know if that is a geographically focused program or not. Um, so some of the work that we do when we do multi-state projects is we'll kind of look at these bigger federal, sometimes it's a federal agency, sometimes organization that's willing to have a bigger geographic area. But then within our states, our team will look kind of for specific funding sources. But it can be really overwhelming for farmers and for others to kind of digest all of the places that you could possibly get funding for incentives to do conservation, and conservation focused on maybe row crop or livestock agriculture. And then there are other funds for forestry practice, sustainable silviculture practices. And so there's lots of different places. So if you're I'll look into that for sure. So thank you for whoever put that there. I appreciate that. Um, but also really encourage folks to look everywhere you possibly can, because there are little incentive mini grant things that pop up all the time.
This next question, they're saying it's hard to care about a problem that you cannot see, meaning excess nutrients in our water, or one that's hundreds of miles away, especially like from Kentucky or Iowa down
Yeah.
in the Gulf.
Yeah.
So how do you encourage people to start caring about this issue?
So excellent, excellent question. And I will say two things. One is yes, it's hundreds of miles away in the Gulf, but all of our states have issues of algae blooms, And it doesn't have to be a harmful algae bloom. Like that is one. So certainly, if you have an example in your state or in your local community where if we have a harmful algal bloom and it gets into our municipal water system, it can shut down the whole place. Like Toledo, Ohio had this situation several years ago. It shut down their entire municipal water system, and people were drinking bottled water for several days because the intake water had these microcystins in it, and they're harmful for folks to ingest. And so, there are situations where we have in Kentucky, we have tons of ponds that are old livestock ponds. And pretty much most of the year now, because our temps are so warm, we'll have, duckweed or algae on the pond itself. And so sometimes that can create local water quality issues. So nutrients, it's the same thing, excess nutrients, just localized versus the bigger scale. The second response I would say to that is part of the work we did early. So prior to these events I told you about, is we had some exchanges on the coast, the Mississippi coast, and we talked to some fishers and fishermen whose families, we went to their dock and we saw their boats, and I took all kinds of pictures, and I show people pictures of these folks. And I say, these guys are no different than our farmers in Kentucky, your farmers in Iowa. These are their families, these are their family businesses, and these boats have been docked because they can't afford to go as far out anymore to fish, or the fish and shellfish they're catching is smaller and they're getting lower returns on what they're catching. So it's not economically feasible for them anymore. And so that they're no different than our farmers. And we're trying right now to figure out how we can have some of those farmer speaker or those fishermen come and speak to farmers in Kentucky and say, we're the we're the end recipient of the excess nutrients that you lose. And it's not good for anybody, right? Our farmers in Iowa and Kentucky and through the whole basin, we don't want to lose nitrogen and phosphorus because those are really valuable on the land. So it's really important for all of us to work on it.
Fantastic. Okay, this next question says that they're wondering how do they get their local extension and soil and water conservation district people involved and excited about stuff like PFI, Practical Farmers of Iowa, One Good Idea, or Iowa Learning Farms type of opportunities.
Repetition, wear them down. I think I think our local extension and conservation districts and any conservation minded office or agency entity are going to respond to requests from their local clientele. So keep requesting that. If you have these resources in your community in terms of those offices and the staff, go ask them. Ask them what they've got available, and ask your friends to go ask them, because it's kind of that squeaky wheel mentality. I know from my experience with our county agents here in Kentucky, they are listening to their local clientele. They maybe have a district board or a board of supervisors for the conservation districts. Talk to those people. Talk to the people who are on those local boards and say, you know what, we need more information for these conservation practices, and hopefully, they will see that there's a local interest and maybe they'll get more involved. And if that doesn't work, there are with our virtual resources available now. We would love to have any farmer who's interested be part of our programs and part of our learning network, and happy to connect them with other farmers who have had those similar experiences.
All right, fantastic. So we have two more questions. One of them, really easy, Amanda. If you could share your contact information in the chat, people are wondering
Sure,
if you could do that.
absolutely.
And then, last question, they said they were a little late to join, so forgive them if it was already mentioned. I don't think it really has been though. Do
Okay.
you have any advice for getting information, like different handouts, regenerative ag or stuff like that, into the hands specifically of landowners? So maybe not farmers, but people who own the land.
Um, so that's a good question. And somewhat tricky sometimes. Like, how do you reach? And I think what I'm hearing is the non-operating landowners. So maybe folks who are renting from them. And so we have I will say, our shop talk tomorrow is a question related to practices put on rented land. And so I know that's kind of an issue. Um, Again, it's kind of, having these conversations, um, asking, the landowners, if you can reach them and have the conversations, that's important. If you can't find them or reach them, I'm not sure, what's going to be the most effective, but really just reaching out and trying to engage with folks and having conversation. Again, I guess I'm kind of an old school communicator. I really like to talk to people, um, and layering that information on. That's the other thing I would say, is sometimes it takes multiple times to see information or be exposed to it to know, or to start to think about, oh, hey, I should really think about this, because we are all bombarded with information, too much really for our brains to process. But if we see the same thing over and over and over again, your brain goes, oh, I guess I should pay attention to this. So repetition, trying to reach out personally. And then if it's, a rented land and it's somebody that you're in communication with, or if you're renting from them, maybe ask if you can put it in a contract that conservation is a priority. And sometimes the landowners really want that. Maybe they feel like they want it more than their tenants. But figuring, just having that agreement somewhere is helpful.
Nice answer. All right, so that's all the questions we have so far. So thank you again for presenting.
Yeah,
And
thanks
again,
for having me.
yes, of course. And to our people in attendance, join us next week with Dr. Catherine Dentzman talking about community-based approach to managing pesticide resistance. So thank you all.